This is part E of episode 1, How's Your Win, from the Black Cats Run podcast. We have an Instagram, at Black Cats Run. Feel free to follow that. That will be a space down the road where folks can contribute topics or questions that they want to hear discussed, or points of view that they think should also be represented. So feel free to check that out and give that a follow so that we have that as a space for further discourse. Here in part 1E, what do we want to talk about? Well, this is going to be our exit ticket by way of conclusion. And the goal here is to try to identify, what are the actionable applications of this. Now, little tiny caveat here. When we say now we're getting to the actionable applications, I actually firmly believe that the process of discussing all of these things up to this point is also actionable, because anytime you're looking to make meaning or understand things in new or better or more effective ways, I think you are moving towards and generating actionable mindsets, because you're thinking in different ways. And that's going to cause you to view things in different ways, in more dynamic ways. It doesn't mean being rejective and replacing with some other dogma. It means increasing our flexibility and our capacity to think in a meaningful sense about the variables that we're encountering, right? And we're trying to empower ourselves to not look for this algorithmic notion, right? I think maybe a lot of people instinctively would question, why could a running watch supposedly know everything there is to know about your recovery or about your training and these kinds of things? And yet I'm sure there are people out there who sort of displace that skepticism and assume, well, this must be the way to do this. But this isn't algorithmic. People are not engineered. I think we've made reference at some point to the idea that when we think about sport, right, and the context in which that emerges, it's emerging, let's try that word again. It's emerging in an industrial space with some very rigid, Victorian, conservative, fixed concepts about people and social class and the capacity of individuals. And that people had inherent attributes, and those attributes were to be identified. I mean, you think about the way in which concepts of intelligence testing emerge in this time period, and the U.S. military, for example, around World War I, doing testing where they would give, for questions where it might be like a light bulb missing the filament, and you'd have to identify what was missing in that object. Well, in the 19-teens, I don't really think that, electric lighting and light bulbs were this commonly consumed or utilized item. So there could have been plenty of people who just wouldn't recognize that. But the willingness at the time was to sort of say that, well, that's representative of fundamental intelligence, and that we can assess somebody's capacities or what they're suited for on that basis. And that's, I think, tells us a lot about where thinking was at that time in general. And so the systems, right, that we've described in the general, and try to be also move towards being a little more specific, right? Systems have emerged based on this idea of a discipline-oriented approach. And that comes from this manufacturing industrial model, right? This managerial model, this efficiency model. I think one thing that would be stereotypically emblematic of that would be the Ford Motor Company, but also other businesses and areas of industry that follow that too, which is, how can we get the most productivity out of people? And, a sort of sad interpretation, which I don't agree with, which I guess is why I'm saying it's sad, would be that the rise of, unions through progressive political movements at the time, you might, crudely identify as people's disinterest in working, which frankly, why would you want to do those jobs? They're awful, tedious, boring, right? But in a worldview of that time, that kind of Victorian, classist, Western, Anglo-Western cultural space, I think the view was that most of these people weren't capable of any kind of higher level of thought, right? That they basically were kind of robots. And that concept of society and distributed ability goes all the way back to Plato's Republic, and probably in other places too that I'm not aware of. But in Plato's Republic, right, he divides society into the, philosopher class, this warrior class, and the rest of the people, the gold, the silver, and the bronze, and the vast majority of people, Plato says, are in the bronze class. But that's and that they just want to drink, and eat and be lazy. And I think that's a common perception of people who have had the benefit of education and opportunity and socioeconomic flexibility. It's easy to then arrive at a different destination as an individual. Just like as an athlete for whom your system of training happened to work for you, it's easy to arrive at the conclusion that what you're doing is inherently effective. But that's not necessarily valid, because to get to that point, you had to be one of the people who wasn't screened out by this discipline method, right? And one way we've said to sort of get through that screening is to be in a situation where physiologically the workouts which you're being asked to do, which might be designed to reflect expectations of performative acts of discipline rather than what's like optimal for competitive development. Although we're also saying that the mindset or the paradigm is that performative acts of discipline aren't performative. The mindset is that like acts of discipline, right, is the act of competition. And so the transference is supposed to be that if you engage in something that requires discipline, it will make competition more effective, because if you do something more discipline oriented, and especially if the discipline is of a greater level of intensity or demand than the competition, then it should make the competition easy. And that's also a prevailing view that I think still exists, which is like, how can you make the competition easy? Which maybe isn't a bad idea per se, but you can very quickly take that, we're suggesting, in a really wrong direction. And by a wrong direction, what we're suggesting is the wrong direction would be to move towards like we just need to go out and just like crush ourselves and, experience pain, right? No pain, no gain kind of idea, because it's not just about physiological response, or almost like the physiological response is secondary to that mental thing, right? 90% mental, 10% physical. But the belief of these that it's worth screening people out is a core cultural belief at the time ideas about training in modern sport are really starting to emerge. And yes, there's evidence of people running and, trying to time things. I mean, obviously the mechanism of timing and the ability to construct and mass produce watches for a lot, most sports have some aspect of timing involved. Baseball is probably one of the few instances where you don't see that. And I want to say cricket as well, but I don't know if I'm embarrassing myself because there's a time component of cricket that I'm not aware of, but I don't think there is, because I'm pretty sure cricket was something that established well before sort of the mass proliferation of, handheld timing devices. But that's also, the timing device is also a product of industrialism. It's also a product of streamlining and efficiency, and this idea of calibrating stuff on that basis of what can you do per time being the most meaningful. And we've seen, today that time performances and running have totally displaced things. And you've seen now that you have a power meter as a system of measurement in cycling, you've seen that totally displace things. You've seen, and certainly in swimming, right, just like running the clock is more significant. And I think you even see record progression in swimming happening at a different rate. Happens more quickly and easily than it does in the sport of running, which I think just creates even more emphasis on the value of the time performance. So these approaches, right, are coming from this worldview at the time. And I think that's the concept of bias. In a pop culture sense, we use bias to sort of slander people. And the accusation is that, well, bias is a sign of somebody's ineptitudes in thinking, or it's a sign of wrongness. And maybe in some instances it can be, right? Because bias can lead us to, miss the best possible conclusion. But the other more accurate understanding of bias is just say that bias is inherent. Like, we're all producing viewpoints on the world that are influenced by experiences we have. And that's bias, right? And that idea, right, that like to understand and try to build more effective systems, or to ask the right questions about systems of training and ask the right questions about what it means to have the athletic experience, requires us to be aware of the things that are influencing our points of view, right? Not to claim that we can be like bias free per se, but to recognize that, well, we need to like account for those things as variables, right? And, weigh our decision making and our reflection accordingly. And that's one piece of what's actionable. By opening through that conversation or that discussion our perspectives to sort of a broader array of possibilities, that's actionable. And the act of discussing is useful. And I go to a lot of professional settings through my job, where there's this prevailing narrative or perspective of like, well, let's actually talk about things that are useful. And the act of discussing is useful, but what happens is when those discussions get censored or shut down, or points of view aren't sort of considered to be sufficiently positive or in keeping with the belief that you have to manage the employees' mindsets in order to be managerially successful, I think that's when that stuff is not so good. And that's why the purpose of this podcast is to just discuss this stuff and try to apply multiple different perspectives. And later in the podcast, I'm going to be trying to bring in a variety of different people that I know to share what they think, and not to reinforce things that I am saying, because I'm not trying to find certain truisms. I'm trying to share where my thinking is at, because I think when we hear other people's thinking, we develop our own thinking. And if you reach conclusions that are congruent or in keeping with conclusions that I reach or things that I suggest, I hope that that's because the reasoning makes sense to you as an independent thinker, not because you've sort of decided that I, as a mouthpiece, have some sort of authority and that should be submitted to. When we think about things that are more actionable, though, in that traditional sense, that's also useful to talk about, because if the discussion has been good and effective and productive, and it's expanded our way of thinking a little bit, then now we should be at a point where we can start to see that and start to apply that forward, right? That's the point, is are there things that can be taken away, and can we create changes in perspective that are actually meaningful and lead to tangible things? Because the athletic experience, the experience of training, the experience of sport is supposed to be meaningful and impactful, and should have some tangibility. Well, I'm trying to make up words off the top of my head. Tangibility, right? Whatever. We'll pretend that's a word. We're trying to create something that's real. Original premise to this as introduction was that journalist asking Robert Williams the question, "How's your wind?" And we sort of took that to give an example of the ways in which we talk about sport isn't really standardized. And part of that is the compartmentalization of experience, and the belief that there are systems specific to certain sports, and then there are certain subsystems specific to certain experiences within sports. And, specialization and specificity are definitely valid things. But if we come back to that question, how's your wind? I think there's actually a lot more validity to that is belied or not initially recognizable because of the anachronistic quality that has, the sort of how are people still talking like that reaction that we might have if we are coming from the perspective of people who do these kinds of endurance sports, where we at least like to pretend that we're more in touch with a stronger idea of physiology and principles of training and stress, strain, stimulus, and adaptation. Because that question, how's your wind, is basically a reflection of, are you out of breath or not? Right? Are you like hyperventilating? Do you feel like your head's in you're breathing through a paper bag, right, or not? Which is then in itself a question of how, are you feeling, and are you feeling comfortable? And I think it's based on this belief that the basketball player, the athlete in the game of basketball, is going to be better and more effective if they're comfortable. Now, I don't actually think that basketball approaches conditioning in a really good way, but I think they're asking the right question, which isn't necessarily the question we ask in running. We say, how does it feel? And we say it feels easy because that's what we're supposed to say, even though it doesn't. And then that gets coaches excited, and they're like, wow, now my athletes can produce even better times for my spreadsheet. And we can run that like that, right? We push them harder. And I would coach and I wouldn't time things. I wouldn't record them, and I mean, maybe I'm slightly overstating that. Sometimes I would look to see and I say, okay, where are we right now, to calibrate and get a frame of reference, because it is useful to know if over time people are at, a same approximate effort producing faster performances over measured courses, in specific sessions. That's one way to try to quantify or verify that your training interventions are working. But we didn't try to make a standardized mindset of, okay, the purpose of workouts is to produce times. I tried to encourage the mindset that the purpose of training and workouts is to induce certain levels of exertion. Because, how can we be strong and powerful and in control when we're doing hard things is the central question. Because being strong, powerful, and in control, I think, combine to create what the experience of feeling good in athletics really is, what that really means. And that's what we need to try to do. So it's not necessarily likely that we're asking this question in the interview of Robert Williams because, we, and I'm saying we here to sort of reference this idea of like the journalist as proxy for what the public wants to know, which might be a little idealistic, but for the purpose of what we're trying to say here, it's fine to say that. And, it's probably not likely that that's representative of this deeper question, right? It might be just that in that concept of we're trying to relate to the athlete by applying the vernacular of the sport, even though we're kind of an outsider always because we're not the professional athlete within that sporting space, right? But we're trying to, gain access and understanding by using what we perceive the vernacular to be. So I am, making mountains out of molehills, but that's the point, is to take these things and inspire further thinking. But if asking how's your wind is an original question, maybe that is what we want to be doing. And by its original question, I mean, that was the question that was in Burt Wilson Marathon Winner. And you have to think that maybe stated in a different version. I mean, not just the fact that it would have been in Finnish, but not English, but in a different conceptual way, but still similar. Maybe that's the question that's behind Paavo Nurmi, right? And so when he's out there working out with his stopwatch, and I think he was somebody who my recollection is would run his records with his stopwatch, and he would pick a specific pace and do that. I mean, he's introducing a strategy to try to engage with that problem, right? Of like how to do harder things, right? And a hard thing isn't necessarily the same thing as a disciplined thing, because hard things can be experienced and addressed in ways that don't meet that archetype of discipline. For Paavo Nurmi, imposing the stopwatch, that's a mindset that I think makes a lot of sense in that in that cultural space, at least that Western cultural space that we've described, of industrial production, management, and then social ideas of classism, discrimination, hierarchy, fundamental ability, right? And all those things come into play and make certain conclusions logical or self-evident, and certain things easy to be dismissed. What I'm suggesting is that it's not about trying to find acts of discipline, engage with those acts of discipline, and then through that process create better results in performance or see improvements in fitness. I think that we want to do is we want to take the hard and make it easy. I want to go back to something I mentioned in the last segment, which I am realizing I didn't necessarily make clear. I talked about how we would see with the cross-country team that I coached, we would see people get to the state meet and suddenly run maybe a minute faster. And I think I said go from like low 17 to low 16, which in that bubble of performance, there is like a big difference between, low 17-minute cross-country races were considered good, but when you get to low 16, now you're on the cusp of really doing something, because if you get under 16 minutes, that was like phenomenal. And in that space, right? And that in different states, in different spaces, right, there's those numbers are going to be different, right? Which I think sort of shows the value of that, right? Every sort of, it's a fishbowl, right? It's its own context, and it creates the own, these ideas of what's meaningful and isn't meaningful, which maybe in the big picture, like those performances might not seem good to certain people for that level. And I am aware of that. And the point isn't to trumpet those things as, outstanding, but it's like, hey, this is the frame of reference within that space, within that sample, right? And we need to know those parameters if we're going to interpret the significance of what's going on in that sample correctly. So the people that we were seeing make these jumps weren't a part of our team. They were people part of other groups. And I want to break this down a little bit more. So again, that random variance wasn't in our runners. We're seeing this coming from other places. And I remember being at the state meet and hearing a coach encouraging the athletes by yelling out to them, remember the big workout. And, to me, I had to sort of bite my tongue when I heard that. I kind of looked the other way because I think I got a pretty funny look on my face immediately, because it was like, that was just insane. Like, that's not going to improve performance. But what that showed was like this core belief that executing the special workout, right, that which we're saying we can better understand what that means now by saying, this act of significant discipline, that's going to transfer into your ability to handle the demands of the state meet, right? Like the state meet is the hardest race. Like that's not true. Like a race is a race is a race. It's just sometimes there's more people at or better than your current ability level, and sometimes there's less people at or better than your current ability level, right? And I guess if you're like the best runner and you can just sort of run a minute faster than the next best runner, well, you have the option of running at the tempo of the next best runner and then friggin' destroying them in the last 200 meters because you'll have all this energy. You have to have incredible speed. A lot of what we think of as speed is really just people not being at a deficit, and then they can just lift their tempo dramatically. It's not, but the concept of speed is also, an act of discipline, that the most disciplined athletes mentally, right, they turn up the pain again, and now they're at a 17 and they're performing this incredible, finishing kick, right? When really your ability to accelerate has to do with not being tired, which I think is probably what Arthur Lydiard recognized and that's why he says about Peter Snell that Peter Snell wasn't, it's not like Peter Snell was basically the fastest person. I think he actually says the opposite, that Peter Snell was one of the, over 200 meters, one of like the least impressive, athletes among the contemporaries that he was, racing at these championship events. So one conclusion, right, that I talked about is the idea of peaking, right? And that's the conclusion that we reached is that special training towards peaking is a joke. And there's evidence in research, though, that supports peaking. And I tried these protocols and it didn't work. It had a negative effect. And it wasn't necessarily that the athletes went backwards. They just showed no real improvement. And then they would all finish and they would walk away and immediately be like, I felt so bad, nothing felt good. And in hindsight, it's like, well, okay, why would running, a couple 400s really fast, 3 or 4 days before the meet, why would that make sense? But when you have the mindset that, well, there's this knowledge out there that I'm not really going to understand, but this is just what's true, it encourages us to not question things and just to accept things and be like, well, that's hard. And hard things are productive, so this must be productive. And, realize that, like, well, if you don't feel good, you can't run well, right? And that's that same concept that I'm saying the value of asking how's your wind is also getting at that concept, right? Like, if your runner goes for the mile mark, and if you were to ask them, if you're able to ask them, how's your wind, then, and they're like, not good, well, they're screwed. They're screwed. And our mantra became, and I would repeat this before every race, patient, persistent, progressive, which was the idea of, you would start out and you needed to feel good at the mile mark. 5/7 of the race, you should feel in control and strong. And then, okay, the last 2/7 you can start to really push into, what can you do beyond where you feel good? Are you able to develop that effort from there? And that's, I think, key, right? Be patient, be persistent, be progressive. And I guess maybe now I'm questioning as I'm saying this, maybe you could say it the other way. Maybe it's be patient, be progressive, be persistent, right? Maybe was more of the point, but it doesn't really matter. The idea is that I haven't used that phrase in practice in a while, so like maybe I'm not remembering exactly, but the point was that you're going and you're saying, okay, the first mile is easy. The second mile, you're developing your effort, and it's in the last mile that you have to really sort of lean into that. And that's when that's sort of the pain that we sometimes associate with exercise, the demand is happening. But if you've managed your effort well through the first 2/3, the first 5/7 of that activity, you're going to be in a position to, be excited and want to execute that. So our conclusion was that feeling good is what's important. And the acts of peaking didn't work to that end. But there's also all this evidence of people who seemingly peaked at the state meet. And part of it maybe is like imposed vernacular of like, well, we're just going to insist that they peaked because they ran a really good race, and we want to say people peaked because that's cool to be able to say that people peaked. So they peaked. But I think that peaking is an illusion, because if you're doing this really intensive training, and this is what we sort of suggested, is we would race obviously the same teams in different contexts throughout the season, which was about maybe 10 to 11 weeks total from like the beginning of organized practice to the last meet. And it wouldn't be until the end of the season that people would start to run well. But like they wouldn't beat us. We would still be way better than them. So I think what was happening is their just performance level was being repressed because they were engaging in these acts of discipline all season, which basically we're saying is essentially too fatiguing. And instead of feeling good, they were trying to like destroy themselves and like ritualistically purify them through, acts of sacrifice in a sense. And it was only when they unloaded that at the end of the season that worked well. So maybe for them running 300-400s really fast, which I don't know that that's what they did, but just as an example of like a suggested peak workout. Well, if they had been running 12 400s like way too hard for the preceding 6 to 8 weeks, even if those 3 400s are still too hard, that's less work than they had been doing previously, so they're going to have more energy. And they might have a higher adrenal response in the race because they finally don't feel as bad. And that's going to kick in and it's going to stimulate them and they're going to, right, again, get that adrenal effect, which is going out there and, whoa, now I'm doing stuff I haven't been able to do before. Whereas for our runners, like the goal is to feel good all along. And then if you're imposing these peaking mechanisms, well, for us, that was like asking us to do more than we'd been doing. And the correction was to be like, we already feel good. Okay. And we want the key thing to break down here is, and this is an actionable conclusion, is it's incorrect, I believe, to say that, well, those athletes did better. I think those athletes would have been from the other teams. They did better than you guys at the end of the season. No, because they didn't beat us. We still crushed them. And, those groups, those programs basically could have been running well all along. So they were basically just denying the athletes the opportunity to be running at this quality level all along. And I think that's probably what have improved their ability to race well. Because they would have had better training. It would have been more effective if they had felt good. It would have been more productive. And like holding athletes out of races, which to me is, first of all, let them race. That's the point of the sport, right? But it seems like every program, no matter how good their best runner was, would basically decide, well, we've got a best runner, so we're just going to hold them out of half of the meets. And there was, the last season I coached, there was a guy from another team who didn't race, who did one meet the whole season to ensure they were qualified so they could actually participate in the state meet. And our best runner, had to do battle with this guy. And it made it really an interesting kind of story or narrative, right? The guy who sat out all season versus our runner who was doing it what people thought was like the old school way, raced and raced and raced. And our runner prevailed. And I would say that the runner who sat out was probably and this is something we'll talk about in later episodes, the concept of talent, but that runner was probably, in the colloquial sense, more talented than our runner, but it didn't matter. And I think if our runner hadn't done all of that racing, I don't think that they would have had the, cognitive development and tuning necessary to get to that, to do that. And if our runner had tried, if we had imposed a peaking protocol, I think then our runner definitely wouldn't have been able to handle that. But, kudos to him because he really executed well. And I think he, showed and demonstrated the benefit of all of the work that he had done in order to, take that guy to the woodshed week after week in that postseason. So I think, it speaks a lot to that difference. So, what we were trying to do is, we did work that was more effective. Like our strategy was this feeling good strategy and trying to get the athletes to where, they were running and they weren't winded, right, to use that old school language. But we're going back to that original question from the beginning of this long century of sport, how's your wind? And we're pursuing it in a different way, right? We're saying, okay, let's build a new response to this. Let's feel good. So we tried to do work that was more effective. And that's what, as athletes, I think we want to do. And now I'm talking about in the context of running, but I'm speaking in general. I think this applies equally to cycling. Because I think the concepts of endurance training aren't domain and system specific. They aren't siloed like that. I think they're ubiquitous. And I think it's just then, interpreting, okay, what would be the specific manifestation of these concepts? And it has to be done like that because different athletes have different levels at any given time. Within the different sports they're doing, different amounts of work are possible or impactful. So we had a higher load of training. We did more training. And I got some comments after I was done coaching, insinuating that we were running 100 miles a week, which is untrue. First of all, we did not count the mileage, or I didn't. I mean, the athletes may have, but I didn't count that in any way, shape, or form. Total that up. I didn't care. It was irrelevant, right? The point is, how are the athletes feeling? But, looking back, we were running maybe at most, maybe 60 miles a week of running. But, most of our runs, the majority of our runs, of our, good aerobic mileage runs, that kind of active training, which is 80 to 85% of what you do, but never really seems to have a cool label like the workout or the long run or recovery day. But just all of the other stuff, which makes it all work, that zone 2 training, I guess we could say, if we want to use a little Indigo San Milan reference, that mitochondrial development training is an act that's really like focused on, for us was like running, 8:30 to 9:30 pace, for, 65 to 80 minutes. And, considering we had in our Petri dish was considered exceptional, we had, 14 or 15 guys running under 1650 and, 3 to 4 guys running, under 1550 or under 16 minutes in the 1550s to the 1530s, to then be out training at that tempo was like considered super unorthodox. And that's like, the Jack Daniels running formula. That is not endorsed by that model. It's unacceptable to be running that slow. It shouldn't create that result. But like, it was about feeling good. It's not about applying the system because that's what it says and that these are the acts of discipline within the system. And so we must do those things. Like, it doesn't matter how they feel. And the fact, if they feel worse, then that's good, because that means we're really, engaging in discipline, and we're really having to set aside, our hedonistic nature to, just try to be lazy and find instant gratification. But, because we felt good, we were able to do a higher load of training than what other people were doing. And I'm sure there were individual athletes from teams who probably were running way more total volume of activity than we were, at least measured in miles. I think that because of our training pace was so relaxed that, our actual, volume measured in terms of minutes may have actually been the highest, which I think raises another question of like, how do we want to measure or quantify the quantity of training that we're doing? Because I think when we do that in different ways, it can cause us to reach very different conclusions. When I think about how the Lydiard athletes ran, I think that sort of core, running volume of 100 miles a week, which seems to be the total volume of that, steady aerobic work, which you might say is that zone 2, zone 3 type intensity. I know that on this Steve Magnus's podcast, they sort of speculated that those guys were running, basically under 5-minute pace all the time. And that could be true, but at the same time, it just seems, unlikely to me that that's really how they were approaching training. If they were doing that for 6 months, I don't know about that. That just seems a little extreme. And again, it's like, well, how were they really, measuring their training at that time? And they weren't using GPS watches. They would have been using watches, pocket watches, mechanical stopwatches over courses, and how accurate are those courses? Like, how are they measuring those? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but, right, I say that those guys were running, maybe closer to averaging maybe 6-minute pace, so they're 100 miles a week. That's about 10 hours a week. And I think our guys, we were probably ended up doing about 10 hours a week of training. So I suppose in an indirect way, you could reach the conclusion that we were sort of applying that concept of like, okay, right, when you get up around 10 hours a week, you start to see really good things happen, right? At least for the distances of that length. And we know now that people can race, 50 kilometers and 50 miles and 100 miles and 200 miles of running too, which then, throws the whole concept of 100 miles a week as being this extreme, overtraining thing out the door. So because of our higher load, right, that was possible because we focused on feeling better, and running at a slower tempo was a way to do that. Right, running at a slower tempo is a way to do that. And the same is true with riding. One of the athletes I work with was cycling, who has, from performance, has gotten herself to the point where she's, objectively established last year that she's a top 20 U.S. Women's rider. When we go out and train, it's like pretty slow. The running, and we do a combination of running and riding. And in a later podcast, I want to talk about, why is that combination more effective than just cycling for the sake of cycling, and why maybe for running, a combination of running and cycling might be more effective too. But the running and the cycling we do is slow because that allows us to feel good. And when we feel good, it makes it easier to train. And in the cross-country context, right, as we're tackling the season, like the intensity and the frequency of training is also then more effective, because when we have a higher load of training, that's not just overall, but the sessions we're doing are better. So we would, at the beginning of the season, we would do our 18-mile run, which was the only run I really cared about how far it was. And then you don't need to do that. You could have just said time, but I knew approximately that, they would maybe run that at about 7:50 to 8:15 pace, depending on the weather and whatever. But we'd have a course, and I'd pick a course for the year that had about 1,700 to 1,800 feet, or as close to 100 feet per mile as I could. And it wouldn't just be one big hill. It would be hills throughout the run. And that was our long run. And then the next day we would do 65 to 75 minutes at 8:30 to 9:30 pace, and it would be flat, and relaxed, and we'd run on the trails, and then we do some strides. So I would call them floats because I didn't want people to sprint them. My experience in high school was doing these strides occasionally, like especially the day before the meet, and they'd be like 60 meter, and they would be like absolute flying sprints. And my senior year, I hurt my hamstring a little bit doing this stuff, and being sort of pitted against the guy on the team who happened to be the reigning state champion in the mile, which I think I was actually quicker than perception would have it. But just doing that, in the strain of that, I hurt my hamstring. Did that derail my athletic career? No, but it's something where, like, if I work hard or I really try to go fast, I will still start to feel that in that particular spot. And that goes back to something earlier I talked about, is that performing acts of discipline causes people to hurt themselves in ways that are permanent and just don't seem to go away. And for me, that's pretty trivial, and I've been pretty lucky with sports injury in general. But like the fact that that's still prevalent, and in college, if we do fast work and 200s, I would start to feel that in that same spot in that hamstring. So for us, right, not pushing it to that level. So, but then on the Wednesday, we would do 20 by 200, where we'd jog for a half an hour. We'd execute 200 on, 200 off, which you might think of as sort of like a structured or a supervised kind of a fartlek. And I sort of just articulated it as that zone 4 to zone 5 feel. And these guys, the top 15 guys running is just en masse around this, might start out running like 40 and might finish running 32 or 33. And it didn't matter that they did that. That's just what happened, is they would feel good. And as they would feel good, the rhythm would develop. And they'd feel stronger. And I would encourage them to cruise at the end, because I knew that you would start to feel charged up, right? And you'd feel good. But the point is that allowed you to execute that work. And that dynamic of going around the track, doing 200s feels like an epic thing, right? But it's actually not that difficult. You're just doing 5 miles where you're just sort of, or 8,000 meters, where you're just sort of alternating like, okay, up-tempo, relaxed, up-tempo, relaxed, right? And the recovery for that was probably, 80 seconds. They would probably take them about 80 seconds to jog the other 200. So it was very rhythmic and it felt good. And if it was hot, we stopped after 10 and people would get some water and we'd do the next 10. It wasn't critical to do it. And then we would jog for another half an hour, right? And so we're doing these things where we're focused on feeling good, but we're also feeling good on the level of like, wow, we're training and we're doing this awesome training and this is so cool and exciting, right? And I really reinforced it. Nobody's training like we are. And that was true, But it's also significant to feel that way because that's exciting about training, is like to do things. I talked about like, this is our creative space. Like we get to invest in that, and, making sure to the extent that I could, that the athletes felt that. And then like, we're a part of, like, we're all doing this together. Like we're applying this unique process and we're benefiting from that, and that should be validating and exciting. Thursday, again, we would do the training where it would be, 65 to 80 minutes, relaxed, same thing we did on Tuesday. And then on Friday, we would do, we went to a park and it had a loop that was about a half a mile, plus or minus, more or less. And we would do 3 sets of 5. And in between, we would take 20 minutes easy jogging, very slow jogging, and then, hydrating. And we do 3 sets of 5. And to be honest, people didn't necessarily do all of them. And in any of these given workout, and we would do this pattern for the first 3 weeks, and then the racing would start, and then we'd move into other things where the workouts would be moderate. So this was sort of, if you wanted to say we had a hardest training period of the season, this would be that. Although the long runs continued up until the week before the state meet. And then we pulled that back to a run of about 11 or 12 miles that was literally as flat as we could make it. Although in hindsight, I think if I had continued coaching, I probably would have made some adjustments to that and not backed off the long run as much, because I think that had normalized so much in the system that, by the end of the championship season, I think people were just starting to go flat. But there could be other explanations for that. And again, right, I didn't have an opportunity to continue to explore that. But with those 800s, some people would be able to do all of them, but some people might do 2 sets, or they might, do 5 and they might do 3 of the next set. And it didn't matter, right? When people were done, they were done, because, and they were empowered to talk about that. And when they said they had enough, that was good enough for me, because the norms of the sport already are telling them to push themselves, and what I need to do is encourage them to chill out and listen to their body, right? And not push themselves too hard. So if they're telling me they're tired, right? And when you start to feel tired, you're tired, right? Recognizing that. And I talked about how for me, I still have a problem where I try to go too hard, too early, because I think that's what it needs to feel like. And the reality is it shouldn't feel like that, because you can't perform well if you don't feel good. Maybe like theoretically, if you could go faster, you'd go faster. But the reality is you can't go that fast. So when you try to do that, you end up just going slower. So the optimal performance is a space where you actually should find that you feel pretty good. And in our training, right, we also weren't trying to do this discipline concept of let's get as close to or as specific to the demands of, racing as possible and experience that race pain. That's not what we were doing, right? Which, I mean, in a modern terms, in a Jack Daniels sense, and again, not to, poo-poo Jack Daniels unfairly. I mean, I think very bright person who did a lot of cool research. And I think all of the things that we think about are going to be subject to review and critique later. And I think that's the value of our contribution, is that we give people something else to think about and to build on. And that's how rational knowledge progresses, just like the things here. I think even within the scale of this podcast, we'll probably come back and be like, wow, how did we say that at that point? That's idiotic to think about now. And the training there, right, to pursue this is, for us, was like aerobic training, right, which to us was sort of like to me, was the concept of how can we take the concept of lactate threshold, as this benchmark of like, okay, if you go above a certain point, like you're no longer getting that aerobic benefit, and that point is at a much lower tempo than you'd think. So for our top guys, we sort of approximated, okay, you guys can probably run 10 miles a little faster than 60 minutes. So we said, okay, about 6-minute pace, 6:20 to 6-minute pace, that's our aerobic work. And so when we did things that were aerobic, like doing, a 4K effort, 15 minutes, at 6-minute pace, or maybe 2 times 4K at 6-minute pace. That might be like a moderate workout we do during the season once the competitions were going, right? Or do a 4K, go out, run some miles at zone 2 at the mitochondrial level, and then come back and do some 200s. But like when we're doing stuff like that, or doing the 20 by 200s in that initial lead into the season, like we're doing this, that's the muscular work. And my philosophy with the muscular work is like it always should be less than 40 seconds, right? Should be less than 40 seconds. And yeah, you can do some things sometimes where you like are doing longer than that, and it's demanding muscularly and aerobically, but it requires more energy, both physical and mental. You can't really do that many reps. And basically what you're doing now is, once again, you're just doing a workout simulating a race, right? Of like, okay, well, if I break this into this workout, I can basically execute faster intensity or a higher level of work than I'm going to do in the race, right? And we just didn't do that. And my feeling was, we have the races in the schedule. We'll go out and we'll do those. Okay, and that's what we need to do. And that's when, like, the natural adrenal response of racing, which is you need that adrenal response to do that kind of discipline training. So the race environment already brings that to the table, because we get to put on our uniforms and we get to put on our race shoes, and like all of these things about entering into that liminal space bring up that level of arousal. And now we can go out and we can crush it. And we would go and we would run 18 miles on Monday, and we would run 5 miles. We'd run 40 minutes, before the weekday meets, and then we go out and we put it down. And then we go out and we jog for a while after. And like they ran hard in those meets, and they could do that, and they would still be running, good times at those meets. And that was the goal. And that was beneficial training, right? And there was your accessing that, but you're accessing this in a fun way because you're doing it in the context of a race, right? That's when it's fun to work really hard and challenge yourself and feel like you're doing something epic and intense, versus other teams holding guys out. We would see guys doing workouts, doing intervals training, and then not racing us on those weekday meets. And then we'd go to the meets and the invitational meets, and we'd crush those guys anyway. So it doesn't mean, by the way, that the things we weren't doing were hard, but it means that we, tried to look at the energy we had around that in different ways. That like feeling good doing hard things was important. And I think that the discipline approach relies on trying to create that liminal space of racing, trying to create that outside of racing, and using that to trigger that adrenal response like happens in racing. For me, I can always do things in races that I just can't do in training. And I have a good friend of mine does exactly in training what he can do in racing. And I'm going to try to have him on at some point, hopefully multiple times, because I think he brings a really different, perspective of personal experience to this stuff. I wouldn't consider him to be a disciple of the discipline model, but, he's an example of somebody whom I think doesn't really agree with the discipline model either, but, has other ways to approach and find training to be effective. So he'll be interesting to talk to if we can get him on here. But like the reason why I think it might be tangibly and definably bad to constantly be in that liminal space in training is because adrenaline also tracks with cortisol, which is stress hormone. And having elevated levels of cortisol really isn't good. There's this TED Talk by Richard Wilkinson where he talks about the psychosocial effects of inequality. And one of the possible causalities that he's hypothesizing in doing this is that, comparative psychology in more unequal societies and athletics can be something that can be its own micro social space of a very unequal society. And teams can be like this too, that, we experience higher levels of stress. And higher levels of stress are cortisol, and adrenaline, although it can be very stimulating, is also releasing that cortisol. And if you're doing training that, like, in order to complete the training, you need to engage a adrenal response, you're saturating yourself in cortisol. Now, I'm sure people who are more knowledgeable about things like cortisol and adrenaline, may be able to question what I'm saying, and I'm open to this, and something I want to learn more about and see if we can discuss this in more detail down the road. But what I'm hypothesizing is that it's possible that like we might be able to tangibly demonstrate that it's destructive because of the higher level of stress we experience from that. In a sense, that could maybe mean that discipline, which is supposed to be about, we've said, avoiding self-indulgence and eschewing things like feelings and whatnot, it actually isn't doing that at all. That it's an adrenal addiction, right? That to engage in discipline in order to get that to work for you, you have to constantly go to that adrenal state, which is this elevated state, and getting amped and pumped up, and let's effing go mentality, right? That sort of thing is maybe that core of addictive response. So we're going to stop here for this section, and we're going to pick it up. We're going to do one more segment, and we're going to conclude and explore some of these more ideas in there. But I'm trying to keep each episode posting under an hour. So we'll stop here, and then we'll quickly try to upload the next segment to pick that up.